Okay, so the software I'm using to make these videos only has a 15-minute recording window, so hence the fact that this lesson has a part 2. We finished up with this then. I've just shown you how to create this GST introduction. As we progress through lessons, you will practice writing some of these yourselves. I just want to show you how to write one in full, and obviously you can go back to this as a guide in future lessons, but something general, something more specific, and then the really important thesis. Now, the wonder of this is this is our platform for everything else, because everything we're going to write in the rest of the essay is going to prove this. So we've said some key things here, haven't we? We've said that he commits the ultimate act of evil by the ages of standard of the age, so that's something we can pick up and develop in our essay. That he faces terrible consequences, increasingly terrible consequences. We've said guilt, regret. We've talked about fear and evil. And we've said that Shakespeare's big message is that consequences are permanent and inescapable if you commit an evil act. So those key words, those key things we've set out in this introduction, we're going to prove. In English literature, English generally, the way we prove it is through textual evidence. We find details in the text, things that happen, words the characters say, and we use that to develop and expand our ideas. So let's go back to the extract then. This, as we know, this part comes from Act 5, Scene 5. Macbeth is about to face the Malcolm's army, and these words are spoken. Macbeth is on stage largely alone at this point, highlighting his solitary nature, the fact really he's been abandoned, he's very much isolated. We meet him at the beginning surrounded by people who respect him and value him. Now we see him on stage alone, ready to face death with no one really, no one there to support him. That in itself is a consequence, isn't it? We can clearly see the rejection by others is a clear consequence for Macbeth. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to have a little look at the extract. You will have studied it in class with your teacher, but you may not remember it all. Please can you take a minute or two to read it, and just have a little think about, make some notes if you can. What does it suggest about consequences to the individual in this section? Which particular words or line could you potentially write about? Okay, so I reckon 5 or 6 minutes, and then you can unpause the video and pick it up again. Okay, great. Hopefully when you started reading it, it was familiar, you could remember it. We've obviously heard a shriek if we just go through it together. So Macbeth says, I've almost forgot the taste of fears. The time has been my senses would have cooled to hear a night shriek. So a scream, he's heard a noise. And my fell of hair would at a dismal treatise rouse and stir, as life were in it. I have supped full with horrors, direness, familiar to my slaughterous thoughts, cannot once start me. So Macbeth is reflecting himself on how much he's changed and how the horrors he's experienced have actually kind of dehumanised him a little bit. He seems to be incapable of normal human responses and emotions at this stage. He then asks, wherefore was that cry? And we discover the Queen, my lord, is dead. We don't see Lady Macbeth's death. We don't learn much about it. She seems to be very much marginalised at this stage. Perhaps punished by Shakespeare for her role in leading Macbeth. I mean, ultimately, we know Macbeth has to kill these characters. Oh, sorry, Shakespeare has to kill these characters off, doesn't he? To have had them live or survive or be victorious would have been treasonous by the standards of the age. So we have this character dead, and it obviously means that Macbeth is now completely alone in the world. So it leads to this deeply moving soliloquy, despite the horrors of Macbeth, despite the terrible things he's done. In this soliloquy, we see a moment of beauty. She should have died hereafter. There would have been a time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So that speech obviously is overwhelmingly bleak in many ways. Macbeth fundamentally saying that life has no value, that life is just full of noise, full of anger, full of stress, and then you die and there's nothing left to show for it, and ultimately you've had no value. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that Macbeth's choices have led him to that. This nihilistic attitude, this sense of valuelessness, is a consequence of his own choices. So as a whole extract, we can see the bleakness of the language, the nihilistic tone very much captures his state of mind. We also need to pick something from the extract to say more about. So we can talk about it in those general terms, but we also need to pick out at least one detail or line. Now, this speech is so wonderful. There's several we could pick. But I think let's make life easy for ourselves. Let's go with the last part, where he describes life. He uses the pronoun it here, but obviously it relates back to this pronoun here, to this noun here, life. And he says that life is like a story. It's a tale, a story, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So even though there's other wonderful lines in there, when you're in an exam hall and you're under pressure and you're stressed, you don't pick lines that are necessarily the most complex unless you're really confident you can analyse them. This line is a big, deep moment in the play. We can pick out and you can talk about the kind of metaphorical use of language here to capture Macbeth's sense of loss and how he feels that because of his evil choices, he's lost everything that gives life value. We will come back to this when we get onto a future stage, which will be writing our essay. But before we can do that, you need to then try to think of quotations, lines from memory or things that happen in the play that also relate to the idea of consequences. So these lines cannot be in the printed extract. You need to think of anything else that happens in the play, anything else Macbeth says that shows that choices have consequences, that prove the things we already said in our GST intro. So, again, can you pause the video? Probably take you 5 or 6 minutes. And from memory, can you try to think of at least one line from the play or one thing that happens that shows consequences are terrible if you do bad things? Or something that happens, a line, you can maybe come up with more. If you can't think of anything from memory, get your school book out, go through your notes and try to find one. And then play the video again once you've found a detail. Okay, great. So hopefully everybody managed to find one. If you did or didn't, here's the ones I found. Macbeth does murder sleep is a nice one, isn't it? Because obviously that's happened immediately after he kills the king. Macbeth thinks he's never going to sleep again, but obviously in class you've talked about the fact, or your teacher will have talked to you about the fact that sleep is a time of peace, a time of emotional and psychological rejuvenation. The fact that Macbeth won't ever sleep again symbolises that he can never be at peace again. He can never re-find himself or rejuvenate who he used to be because he's crossed a moral boundary. The wonderful, joyous, full of scorpions is my mind. As I've said to you before in a previous session, that line is great because we can fit it to so many questions. We got such a sense of evil contaminating him here, such a sense of Macbeth emotionally harming himself through his own choices. And you could refer to Banquo's ghost. That's not a line from the play, but if you struggle with memorising lines, Banquo's ghost is a consequence. Ghosts symbolise being haunted. Shakespeare and Macbeth is haunted by his choices, haunted by the evil he's committed, haunted by his guilt. So we can make a reference to that. And then those of you who are taught by me will know my favourite line of the whole play, the rivers of blood metaphor. Loads of analytical potential with that one. The line is quite long. Some of you will memorise the whole line of the rivers of blood speech, where Macbeth says that going over were as tedious as returning were as tedious as going over. He's imagining himself in the middle of a river of blood, and he doesn't seem to have the desire or the ability to save himself, so he commits to continuing on his tyrannical path. But you don't necessarily need to memorise that whole line. you can refer to it as the rivers of blood metaphor. Okay, so that's it for this session. The next session we'll be looking at how we write an essay, but it's going to take a bit of time to do that. I'd like to do it all in one go. So I think hopefully you've seen the beginnings of the process of engaging with the task. You might, as a little task for you to do, want to practice writing a paragraph about one of these lines. Using the model we've done in class, we've done loads of these in class, so using the format we've done in class, pick a line, write an analytical paragraph about it. As a practice, ready for tomorrow's essay writing. For now, well done, guys. Hope you're keeping safe, and I'll speak to you, I'll do another of these videos for the next lesson.